They said no wolf would ever do it. Not guard a human child. Not freeze for one. But when they found him half buried in snow ribs, showing eyes dull with pain, he was still alive. And so was the baby tucked under his chest, like a secret worth dying for. He should have run. He should have let go. But something told him to stay. Something deeper than instinct. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about a promise made in silence. And the wolf who kept it. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Juneau, Alaska. The snow hadn't stopped in 2 days. Wind raced down the ridgelines of Glacier Valley, howling between pine trunks and whispering over the roofs of quiet cabins. The sky had turned into a pale wall of moving white, and even the wolves, who were usually invisible ghosts in the forest, had gone silent. Deputy Mason Ridge. 41 stood by the open door of his county-issued truck coat, stiff with frost eyes narrowed beneath the brim of a snow-dusted cap. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and a jaw that rarely moved unless he had something worth saying. A former Marine, now the quiet core of Juneau's wildlife response team, he had spent more time in the backcountry than the town itself. His hands were thick and steady, and they always moved like they were still carrying a rifle. Beside him, stomping his boots against the cold, was Riley Knox, 27, a wildlife tech with more curiosity than patience. Riley was lean, quick-moving, with a mop of dirty blonde hair constantly falling over his eyes. Raised on a ranch outside Sitka, he'd grown up tracking elk and fixing fences, but his passion lay in reading the woods, scat prints, broken branches. All of it spoke to him like a second language. They were halfway up an unmarked service trail that curved along the edge of the valley, called in to investigate strange sounds reported by a trail camera. The temperature had dropped to 5 degrees and kept falling. Mason cut the truck engine and stood in silence, listening. There it was again. A growl, low and broken, drifting on the wind. "That's not a coyote," Riley said, glancing at Mason. "No," Mason replied, voice flat. "That's pain." They grabbed snowshoes from the truck bed, clipped flashlights to their jackets, and headed into the trees. The wind slapped their faces raw, but they pressed forward, stepping carefully through knee-deep powder. Minutes passed, then Riley stopped, pointing. There, near the base of a frozen ridge, something large was half buried in snow. Mason raised his light. What they saw rooted them both in place. A massive gray wolf, dark fur rimmed in white frost, lay curled around something. One paw stretched out protectively, ribs rising and falling shallow. Its eyes yellowed and bloodshot, open just enough to track their movement. A deep growl rumbled through its chest, but it didn't move. It couldn't. It, nestled against the wolf's belly, wrapped in tattered fur blankets, was a baby. Riley dropped to his knees, blinking. Holy God. That's a human baby. "Looks about 5 weeks old," Mason said, crouching beside him, still breathing. Riley reached forward carefully. "Where'd it come from?" "There's no cabins within 5 miles. The child let out a soft whimper. Its cheeks were flushed red from cold, but its body somehow still warm. Mason slowly brushed snow from the wolf's body. "We can't move them separately. He's guarding the kid." The wolf gave another strained growl, more breath than threat, then rested its head again on the snow. Mason studied its frame. Old scars crisscrossed its hind legs, and fresh blood stained its chest. "We need heat," Mason said. "Truck's too far." "We head to the forest post, half a mile west." But the signals Riley started. "Storms cut everything. We don't wait. Grab that field stretcher from the truck. We take them both." It took them 15 minutes to carry both the wolf and child on the canvas stretcher through the thicket. Mason led the way, flashlight steady Riley, trailing behind, murmuring soft encouragement to the bundle beneath the wolf's chest. The baby slept soundly, as if lulled by the pulse of the beast protecting it. They reached the Forest Service cabin just before dusk. It was a single-story wooden shelter, reinforced after the last avalanche season, with emergency power and stocked medical gear. Riley kicked the snow from the doorframe and pushed inside, while Mason laid the stretcher by the heater vent. Inside, the air was frigid, but less brutal than outside. The generator clicked on, flooding the room with dim yellow light. Riley fumbled with a thermal blanket and laid it over the baby. We need to get him hydrated fast. The wolf, too. Mason approached the animal slowly. He's still alive but fading. The wolf's ears twitched faintly as Mason knelt. Easy, Mason whispered. No one's taking him away. You hear me? He ran a hand lightly across the wolf's matted neck, feeling for wounds. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it gave a low exhale, and for the first time closed its eyes. Riley sat on the floor, unzipping the emergency med pack. No collar, no tags. He's wild, but he stayed, Mason said. That's not instinct. That's loyalty. The snow began to pound against the cabin roof, muffled but furious. The wind hissed through the vents, making the place groan with pressure. Outside, the sky had gone to ash. Riley leaned over the child, checking his breathing again. Still strong. Whatever this wolf did, he kept him alive. Mason stood slowly and walked to the cabin window. Through the frost, he could just make out the outlines of distant pine trees, swaying in the wind. He didn't say it out loud, but something in his gut twisted. This wasn't coincidence. Something or someone left that child out there. And the wolf had chosen not to run. Not yet. The cabin's heater whined against the cold, sending shallow pulses of warmth across the floorboards. Snow continued to fall hard against the windows, turning the world outside into a blurred canvas of white and shadow. Inside, the wolf lay still, its breath faint, but steady, its large frame curled instinctively around the child. Deputy Mason Ridge sat against the wall, arms crossed, boots heavy with snowmelt. His eyes rarely left the wolf. Riley Knox paced near the supply shelf, hands twitching with restless energy, mumbling to himself about formula hydration levels and emergency IV kits. The cabin was silent except for the wind and the occasional soft sigh from the baby. An hour passed before help arrived. The soft crunch of boots on snow outside made both men straighten. The door opened with a gust of wind, and a tall figure stepped inside, hood pulled low over her auburn hair. Lainey Mason said with a nod. Dr. Lainey Harrow, 36, had the calm precision of someone who'd held life and death in her hands too many times to flinch anymore. She had returned to Juneau just last year after a personal tragedy in Seattle that left her clinic there closed and her voice quieter than it used to be. A streak of gray ran through her hair, though she rarely acknowledged it. She wore a thick utility jacket stained with old iodine and fleece gloves that didn't quite hide the weariness in her movements. She knelt beside the wolf without a word. Her hand moved gently along the ribs, checking for breaks. Then she looked up at Mason. How long has he been like this? Best guess, he said. 2, maybe 3 days, without food or shelter. Lainey pulled her stethoscope from her pack and listened to the wolf's chest. Heart's weak, but he's fighting. Her other hand moved to the baby. She studied its face, ran her fingers over its limbs, and then paused. She turned him slightly and parted the blanket. Beneath the layer of swaddled warmth, just under the child's left rib, was a faint surgical scar, thin, neat and unmistakable. Her heart stilled. No, she whispered. Riley tilted his head. What is it? Lainey looked up slowly, her voice caught between disbelief and recognition. I did this. I stitched this. Mason frowned. You sure? I don't forget scars, she said softly. 3 weeks ago. Someone left this baby outside my clinic in a wooden crate covered in a wool blanket. No name. No note. I treated him for dehydration and a mild infection. He was gone the next morning. She exhaled sharply, remembering the panic of waking to an empty crate and snow already falling thick outside. They searched, reported it, even notified the local shelter. But no one came forward. And now, here he was again alive, and with a wolf that refused to leave his side. Lainey adjusted the stethoscope and examined the wolf again. Her fingers brushed something under the thick ruff of his neck. She paused, parting the fur more carefully this time. Something metallic glinted. A thin strip of metal hung from a collar nearly buried beneath the dense fur. She tugged it gently and read the etched letters. Protect him. She looked at Mason. This was intentional. He wasn't just guarding by instinct. He was sent to do it. Mason crouched beside her, brow furrowed. You're saying he was trained? I'm saying she said this animal has more discipline than most humans I know. And whoever put him with the baby knew what they were doing. Riley chimed in, voice tight with disbelief. But he's a wolf, maybe Lainey said. Or maybe he's something in between. She moved to clean a wound on his flank. Her gloved fingers came away red and sticky. Several lacerations crossed his ribcage. Some deep, some shallow, all poorly stitched. These aren't wild wounds, she said. They're field sutures. Done in a rush, but by someone who cared enough to try. As she disinfected and closed the worst of the injuries, she glanced at Mason. He's not just a stray. Someone was tending him, keeping him alive long enough to finish whatever mission he was given. The phrase sounded odd even to her ears. A mission, could a wolf have one? They were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Riley opened it cautiously, revealing a young woman in a snow-soaked parka, cheeks flushed, breathing hard from the hike. Callie Reese, 24, was a seasonal volunteer at the local wildlife shelter. She was short, energetic, and always wore 2 mismatched gloves. She carried a portable med scanner and a satchel full of basic supplies. I heard the emergency broadcast before the signal cut out, she said, shaking snow from her boots. You said you had a wild and critical condition. Lainey nodded toward the wolf. More than critical, and more than just wild. Callie's eyes widened when she saw the baby, then softened as she moved closer. Oh my God. They spent the next hour stabilizing both child and wolf. Callie gently held the baby, while Lainey monitored fluids and stitched the torn hide with steady hands. The wolf barely stirred, but once, when Lainey pressed a warmer under his belly, he let out a low breath and shifted just enough to pull the child closer to his chest. Riley blinked. He still thinks he has to protect him. Even now, outside the storm deepened. The cabin walls groaned under the weight of snow, and visibility vanished into a wash of gray. No radios worked, no cell towers reached. They were alone. Later that night, Mason stood watch by the window, while Lainey sat beside the wolf, one hand resting lightly on his neck. I think he remembers me, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Mason glanced over. I saw him once before, she continued. At the clinic, 2 months ago. A man brought in an injured stray he said he found on the roadside. It was this wolf, or one just like him. I patched him up, but the man left before I could ask questions. The dog, or wolf, vanished. I thought I imagined the whole thing. Not your imagination, Mason said. No, she agreed. This animal has been following orders. He was trained to guard this boy. But now, something's changed. Whoever sent them isn't coming back. The wolf stirred slightly and opened one amber eye. He met Lainey's gaze for a moment. She didn't flinch. You're not just a wolf, she whispered. You're something else. Morning came pale and slow, filtered through layers of cloud that still hung heavy over Juneau. The wind had softened to a moan, but the snow clung to every limb and rooftop, a heavy white silence pressing down on the forest. Inside the cabin, the heater buzzed faintly, and the scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. Deputy Mason Ridge stood by the window sipping lukewarm coffee from a metal mug, his eyes scanning the tree line. His breath fogged the glass, as he watched the shapes of snow-laden pines swaying like ghosts. Behind him, Dr. Lainey Harrow sat cross-legged near the sleeping wolf, who hadn't moved in hours, but remained wrapped protectively around the child. Riley Knox stretched his arms and moved toward the back door boots crunching on the thawing floor. "You see that?" he asked, peering through the glass. Mason followed his gaze. Near the side of the cabin, something dark cut across the snow, a thin line jagged and uneven. "Blood," Mason muttered. "Fresh." Lainey looked up. "The wolf hasn't moved since last night." Riley was already pulling on his coat. "Then it's not his." Mason opened the door, stepping into the cold. Riley followed close behind their boots, punching into the hardened surface of the snow. The blood trail curved east thin at first, then heavier. It wove between the trees and down a shallow incline toward a stretch of forest few people ever entered. After a quarter-mile, they came upon a half-buried wire fence, rusted and leaning. A broken sign jutted out of the snow, barely legible. "Whisper Hollow Sanctuary." Mason stared at it, jaw tight. "I thought they shut this place down 5 years ago." "They did," Riley replied. "After the audit and those allegations of abuse." They climbed over the bent wire and pushed deeper. What was once a small complex of animal pens and prefab buildings was now a graveyard of metal and decay. One building had collapsed in on itself, its roof pancaked under snow. Another stood crooked, its windows, smashed doors hanging by rusted hinges. Inside the nearest structure, the air smelled of mildew, urine, and old neglect. Mason and Riley moved carefully. The floors were warped and soft in places. Overturned cages and shattered glass littered the path. Scratch marks lined the lower walls, long, desperate clawings etched into the paint. "Something tried to get out," Mason said quietly. "Or someone kept it from leaving," Riley added. In the back room, they found a broken kennel gate, its mesh peeled outward, like it had been torn from the inside. A red-stained blanket lay in the corner. Mason crouched, brushing it aside. "Still damp," he murmured. Riley searched through the debris, his flashlight bouncing off scattered metal bowls, torn records, and one shattered desk. Near a toppled shelf, something caught the light. He reached in and pulled it out, a cracked nameplate, tarnished with age. "Juno," he read aloud. Could that be his name? Mason looked up from the stained blanket. Could be. Would explain the tag on his collar. Protect him. Maybe this was his last order. The moment lingered. Then from Mason's coat pocket, Laney's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, frowning. Unknown caller. He answered, switching it to speaker. The voice was low, male, steady but strained. "You have them, don't you?" Mason's grip tightened. "Who is this?" "The wolf. The child. They're with you now." "Who are you?" Mason demanded again. Silence. Then the line went dead. Riley stared at the phone. "That's not random." No, Mason agreed. "That's someone watching us." They returned to the cabin more quickly than they'd left. Laney looked up when they entered, her eyes sharp. "What happened?" Mason set the phone down on the table. "We followed the blood. Led us to Whisper Hollow." Her brows furrowed. "That place should have been condemned." "It's not empty," Riley said. "There's signs of struggle. Cages torn from inside. One had a blanket with fresh blood. And this." He held out the nameplate. Laney took it, turning it over slowly in her hand. "Juno," she repeated. So he did have a name. She looked toward the wolf, still resting still, curled around the child who had begun to stir more often now. His fingers flexed in sleep. She knelt beside him, running her hand along the wolf's spine. "Who trained you?" she whispered. "Who left you there?" The door creaked behind her. A new figure stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. Wes Harlan, 45, was the Wildlife Division's logistics coordinator. Burly, bearded, and always in a plaid jacket, he was known for two things: fixing anything with duct tape and remembering every animal that had come through the system. "We got a pulse from the radio tower," he said, holding up a walkie. "Briefly. Long enough to get your signal." "You all right?" Laney nodded. "Physically, yes." He looked at the wolf and raised a brow. "That him?" "We think his name's Juno," Mason said. Wes exhaled. I remember a Juno. Came through about a year ago. Big male but different. Eyes too sharp. Wasn't on any of our local registry. Rumors said he came from a failed training program up north. Private. Quiet. Laney's face tightened. Then this isn't just about a lost pup and a loyal animal. Someone left them out there on purpose, Riley added, and someone else wants them back. Wes rubbed his beard. You need to be careful. If this was tied to Whisper Hollow, then whoever was running it might still be operating just out of sight. The baby stirred again. Laney lifted him gently, checking his temperature. Still stable. She held him close, breathing in the faint scent of skin, milk, and pine. We're not giving him up, she said. Mason didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said the same. Later that night, as wind began to pick up again, and snow started falling once more, Laney stood outside the cabin watching the darkness. The pines whispered, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Behind her, Juno shifted in his sleep and let out a low, uneasy growl. Snow continued falling in waves, thin and whispering now, as the storm finally broke into stillness. In the quiet cabin nestled beneath the trees of Glacier Valley, the wolf named Juno stirred faintly in his sleep, his body no longer trembling, though his breathing remained slow. The child beside him swaddled in reclaimed wool, and warmth had begun to stir more frequently, fingers curling and unfurling lips, making soft murmurs. The sun, pale and strained, broke briefly through the clouds, casting silver onto the iced-over windows. Laney Harrow stood at the counter near the small medical station, updating her field notes. Her handwriting was meticulous, even when her thoughts weren't. She documented every heartbeat, every breath, every shift in the wolf's temperature, and the baby's recovery. Beside her, Wes Harlan refilled the kettle, watching her with quiet concern. You haven't slept, he said. And we don't know what's coming. Laney gave a short smile. That's exactly why I haven't slept. Riley Knox was outside tending to the backup generator and checking the fuel supply. Mason Ridge paced along the wall, unable to shake the sensation. From yesterday, the anonymous caller, the abandoned training compound, and the name etched into that tarnished plate, Juno. Everything was unraveling. The knock came at midday. Sharp, 3 times. Mason opened the door slowly, hand near his belt. Standing there was a man they had never seen before. Tall, fit hair, dark and neatly styled, wearing a charcoal-colored trench coat and leather gloves, despite the bitter wind. His jaw was clean-shaven, his face long and pale, and he wore a look of someone used to walking into rooms and taking control. Dorian Slate. 45 exuded precision. There was no softness in his posture, no uncertainty in his gaze. His eyes were gray-blue, clinical, almost distant. A black satchel was slung over his shoulder, and in his hand, he held a sleek black folder. I'm here on behalf of a private recovery agency, he said smoothly. I believe you have custody of a wolf named Juno. He is by all documented records the intellectual and biological property of an experimental training division formerly located in Anchorage. Laney stepped forward immediately. And you are? I am the licensed handler appointed by the Residual Oversight Board of the previous program. I have documentation authorizing his retrieval. He handed the folder to Mason, who opened it slowly. The papers were clean, crisp, professionally formatted. Typed signatures, stamps, notarization. Everything looked real. Laney crossed her arms. That program was terminated 3 years ago. Closed by federal order. I've seen the report myself. Closure doesn't equal forfeiture, Dorian said calmly. He was never adopted, never released. He remains classified as an active research subject under a private holding clause. Riley had returned, and now stood just behind Mason, frowning. You mean he's property? That is the legal terminology. Yes, Dorian said. Laney's voice hardened. He has a name. He made choices. He guarded a baby through a blizzard. He's not a test subject. Dorian turned to her with a slight, practiced smile. And yet Dr. Harrow, he was assigned. Trained. Controlled. What you're describing is the residue of conditioning. Lainey opened the cabinet and pulled out her field scanner. She moved to Juno, who raised his head at the tension, but didn't move. She passed the device over the collar. A soft beep. The screen lit up. VTR 2410. Valor Therapeutic Rehabilitation Program, she read aloud. Status terminated. Handler discontinued. Custody unassigned. She turned the screen toward Dorian. That doesn't belong to you. Dorian's jaw tightened. You misunderstand the nature of the agreement. Before he could continue, the door opened again. A blast of cold rushed in, and behind it came the sound of boots. Clara Winslow, 52, stepped inside with a sense of command that immediately shifted the room's energy. Her gray blonde hair was pulled back into a no-nonsense bun. She wore a state-issued parka steel-toed boots and a badge clipped to her collar. Her expression was unreadable, forged from decades of dealing with the ugly end of animal protection law. She had the kind of presence that didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. I got the emergency dispatch on the way back from Sitka, she said. This the man. Mason handed her the folder. He says he's here to claim the wolf. Clara flipped through the pages quickly, her fingers scanning like a scanner. Valor was dissolved. I helped write the dissolution protocol. No animal from that program is considered reclaimable unless already assigned. This says, unassigned. Dorian opened his mouth. She held up a hand. Don't. I've been in courtrooms too long to fall for phrasing. Whatever this wolf was trained for is over. And whatever you represent doesn't exist here anymore. Dorian's calm fractured slightly. You're making a mistake. Clara stepped forward. No. You made one by walking in here thinking no one would notice. This animal isn't property. And you don't have jurisdiction in this county. Juno rose unsteady but alert. His eyes locked on Dorian's. A low rumble built in his throat. It wasn't a snarl of fear, it was warning. The child stirred beside him, and Juno stepped slightly forward, putting his body between Dorian and the baby. It was instinct, but it was also memory. Do you see, Lainey said quietly. He remembers. Dorian stared for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. This isn't the end. Clara crossed her arms. No, it's the beginning. The state will initiate a transfer of protective custody. Until then, you're trespassing. And you're leaving. He turned without another word and stepped out into the snow. They watched his car fade into the trees. Clara turned back. File every report. Keep every note. This isn't over and he's not alone. Lainey looked at Juno. Neither are we. 3 weeks passed. The snow hadn't stopped, but it had softened less fury now, more rhythm falling in slow spirals that blanketed the peaks of Juno and wrapped the hills in muted white. In a small clearing just beyond Glacier Valley, the old ranger station had been transformed. What was once temporary shelter was now permanent refuge. Snowlight Refuge. A modest animal rehabilitation center built from timber and resolve had been officially licensed with the state. The sign, carved by hand, hung above the door, flanked by paw prints, painted in navy blue. Inside the space pulsed with quiet activity. The hum of heaters, the rustle of blankets, the steady steps of survivors adjusting to a new kind of safety. Lainey Harrow stood in the main room, her auburn hair tied back in a braid, sleeves rolled past her elbows. She moved between crates and cushions, with natural grace, jotting updates into a binder. Her expression, still lined by fatigue, was lighter now. Hope, though cautious, had returned to her face. In the far corner of the room, the wolf named Juno lay curled on a thick fleece blanket, his coat glossier, now ribs no longer as sharp beneath fur. His eyes, a rich amber, remained watchful, but not tense. Tucked beside him, chewing clumsily on a cloth toy, was the child who had survived the storm at his side. They'd named him Noah. It wasn't official, no paperwork, no birth certificate yet, but it fit. Mason had suggested it half as a joke, half as a prayer. Lainey had written it on a clipboard, and somehow that made it real. Noah was 6 weeks old now, healthier, stronger. His cheeks were round, and his eyes tracked movement. He laughed often tiny, breathy squeals that always made Juno raise his head with alert softness, as if those sounds were sacred. Mason Ridge still came by daily. He never stayed long. He wasn't the type for idle talk. But each time he checked the locks, reviewed the footage from the motion sensors installed around the perimeter, and left behind a fresh thermos of coffee without saying a word. Riley Knox had taken to reading to Noah during the afternoons. Children's books, wildlife guides, old field logs from his grandfather's cabin. His voice was calm and unhurried when he read, and sometimes Juno would lay his head on Riley's boot listening. That morning, the sun crested gently above the tree line, painting everything in shades of pearl and gold. Laney had just stepped outside to shake out a blanket when Juno lifted his head sharply, ears forward. Laney froze. Juno stood limping slightly, then walked past her nose to the ground. He moved toward the tree line behind the fence. She followed. That's when they heard a faint yelp, muffled by snow, sharp with fear. Juno bounded forward without hesitation, pushing through the snow-laden branches. Laney ran after him, breath catching in her throat. 100 yards beyond the property line, nestled between two boulders, was a sight that made her heart clench. A small wolf pup, no older than 10 weeks, gray and white mottled fur crusted with ice, lay curled in the snow, one back leg twisted unnaturally beneath it. Its breaths were shallow. Its eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then closed again. Juno approached slowly. Low to the ground, body tense but gentle, he sniffed the pup, then lowered his head beside it and let out a low whine, soft, coaxing. The pup stirred faintly. Laney crouched beside them. "Okay, little one," she whispered. "Let's get you warm." They carried the pup back in an old gear bag lined with a scarf and heating pad. Back at Snowlight, Callie Reese, who now volunteered full-time, helped Laney set the pup up near the fireplace. Callie, 24, bright-eyed and always practical, handled animals the way some people handled broken hearts, with quiet care and steady hands. "I'll monitor fluids," she said. "That leg may need splinting." Laney nodded, already prepping supplies. Juno didn't leave the pup's side. When Noah awoke from his nap and crawled toward the fireplace, he paused at the edge of the blanket. His little hand reached out, gently patting the new pup's ear. He smiled. "Looks like he's already named her," Callie whispered. Laney turned, brow raised. Callie shrugged. "I checked. She's a girl." Laney looked at Noah again, who giggled and patted the pup once more. "Sky," she said softly. "That feels right." Outside, dusk approached. Riley lit the porch lanterns. Mason arrived with his thermos and a box of screws for the door hinge, which had started to creak. No one said much, but the house felt full alive. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep, curled against Juno's side, and Sky had drifted off wrapped in a heating pad, Laney stood on the porch with Mason staring out at the forest. A soft wind moved through the trees. "He found her," she said. Mason nodded. He knew. "Do you think someone left her there?" she asked. "On purpose. I think whoever trained Juno never expected him to think for himself," Mason replied. "But he did. He chose." Laney swallowed. "And now he's teaching them." Mason didn't answer. He didn't need to. Behind them, inside the warm glow of the refuge, Juno lifted his head and watched the two sleeping pups. He stood, slowly walked to the door, and settled at the threshold. Guarding. Always guarding. In that moment, something deep inside him seemed to ease. His muscles relaxed, his breathing deepened, and for the first time in weeks, he closed his eyes, not out of exhaustion, but peace. Sometimes the strongest protectors come not from orders, but from quiet choices. Juno was never just a wolf. He was a guardian who stood between innocence and danger, not because he had to, but because he chose to. In the middle of a storm, he didn't run. He stayed. And in doing so, he saved a life. In our own lives, we don't need to wear a uniform or have perfect words to make a difference. Sometimes it's showing up for someone. Sometimes it's simply not walking away. We are all given moments to protect, to heal, to stand in the gap for someone who can't stand alone. If this story touched something in your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us what this story meant to you. And if you believe in loyalty and second chances, and in silent strength, subscribe to the channel to help us share more stories that matter.